In 2023, Oracle did a study across 14,000 employees and business leaders. 72% admit that the sheer volume of data and their lack of trust in the data has stopped them from making a decision. I've definitely heard leaders say we need better data before we can make that decision. And often they're right. But there's a point where waiting for perfect data becomes its own form of indecision. And that's what we want to talk about today. Welcome to Charter Industry Talks, where we address common technology issues in industrial environments. Every era has its favorite tools. Right now it's AI, cloud, and automation. But the underlying problems, like getting the right information to the right people, or making good decisions during uncertainty, or maybe it's just keeping operations running when things break, those issues have not really changed. This series of talks is about those problems. We talk to people who have experience in energy resources and industry in general. I'm Roland Plett, a leader in Charter's industrial practice, and today I've got two great guests with me, Mark George bringing the business leadership perspective, and Wade Crick bringing the technology transformation perspective. I'd like to start by just asking each of you what your initial thoughts are about this decision-making process and why it is that companies get stalled in making decisions relative to the data that they have at their disposal. What are your initial thoughts on this topic?
I think a couple terms that get used: data, which is kind of raw material, and then there's information. Information is taking that data, and data comes in, structured format, semi-structured, unstructured. Certainly in the industrial space, environments have a huge amount of unstructured data that can now be processed. But again, that raw data has to be turned into information that can be used for business decisions. If we think about the financial reporting of a company, so every quarter they have to provide financial reporting if they're a publicly traded company. They need accurate information in the income and the expense side of it and so on, and that is critical. And indecision can come about because they don't trust the data, which is the wrong building material, to go turn it into dashboards, reports, and information that they are going to report on. And it's important to make that distinction. You got to take the raw material and refine it to turn it into something useful for the business. And if you don't trust it, if you don't have it organized well, if you don't understand what you have, then you can't get to that good information you need to make business decisions.
Right. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about the types of data that we can draw on. I guess at a business level, Mark, how do you see this decision-making process? What are business leaders really looking for from a data perspective that kind of gives them the indication, okay, we have enough to make a decision?
Well, Roland, I'd say that leaders know that they need better data, but they end up waiting. Waiting for data or for perfect data can become a very expensive habit. And this whole idea of cost, from my perspective, can be broken into two categories. One is quantifiable business, maybe financial losses, and then the cost of psychological or well-being strains on the organization. McKinsey and Company created a metric called the McKinsey Decision Inefficiency Metric. They estimated that for an average Fortune 500 company, inefficient decision-making translates to more than 530,000 days of lost working time.
Wow.
And roughly 250 million in wasted labor costs annually. More importantly, what they also found out is that indecisive teams take up to 40% longer to deliver results, which obviously compounds operational overhead. So we know that leading companies use data effectively. We know that to be a market leader, and what CEO doesn't want to be a market leader, need access to that data. But at what cost? if you're waiting for that perfect data. And by the way, I also mentioned there was two parameters to this whole idea of psychological or well-being costs.
Yep.
There was also another research study done by personality and individual differences. And they found that indecision is not a neutral pause button, but a psychological tax. So that fundamentally, then, the longer people take to make a decision, it's taxing their anxiety. It's creating more stress. And this whole idea of prolonged dissatisfaction results, well, you can just imagine then an indecisive organization where people are getting frustrated. How long do they want to stay with that type of corporation? So you tie this all now back to data. This whole idea of leaders fear making strategic mistakes because they are waiting for the perfect data. They better get over it.
Wow, that's a powerful message. I really like your emphasis on there isn't such a thing as a neutral waiting ground, right? You can't place a pause on business. You're either moving forward or you're moving backwards. On that note, let me ask you, Wade, what aspects of data do people not trust, right? What leads people to not trust the data that they have?
I would say if they don't know the lineage or how that data worked through their various processes and who touched it and who may have modified it, that would lead to distrust of a number that you presented to go and report on, the source, the quality, how old it is. I mean, one of the companies you and I worked at previously, we could find PowerPoint decks that would prove any point we wanted on a product because there was no there was no aging out of historic data. I mean, you have to decide that I'm only going to keep data on this particular subject for a certain amount of time before you should purge it, So the good housekeeping around data is no different than housekeeping in your own personal house or garage. In our industry, everybody wants to keep data forever, and that's kind of a bad practice in a way. But certainly there should be certain types of data that you keep for a long period of time, but then there's other types of data that is no longer valuable, that should be deleted and purged out, But that all leads to indecision. There was another company that you and I know of here in Alberta that was using Microsoft platform and producing Power BI type dashboards. And they actually had more Power BI dashboards to look at than the number of employees. So, that doesn't lead to quality decisions. Which dashboard do you want to trust, right? You have to focus on what's important and make sure you have that gold record that you truly know you can trust your business decisions around what product you want to build, what customers you want to service, and so on.
That's interesting. I want to ask one more question around that, Wade, but this whole notion that actually eliminating bad data is probably as important or more important than going looking for new data. That's actually really key in cleaning up the whole data support structure for decisions. I want to ask you about where you find more data. I don't get the sense that this is about having to go and put more sensors in the system all the time, or even finding new, places to pull data from. What are some of the sources of even existing data that people don't have access to today, and how do they get that access? And then we'll get back to some more some more business related questions.
Yeah, that's a great question, Roland. And again, I mentioned earlier that if we go back, say, 40, 50 years ago, which is a long time ago in our industry, but data came really in two useful forms. It was either just a file or some sort of structure assigned to it where there was an index, but it was organized in rows and columns or some way to actually get value out of it. And now we're here in the age of AI. The unstructured data is really the vast amount of information that can now be used to make better business decisions. And that comes in Word documents, emails, PDFs, videos, audio, various files. And it turns out that in an industrial environment, that actually represents a lot more volume than the actual data coming off of sensors, which by itself is an immense amount of data. It can be petabytes in a day. But it turns out the unstructured data associated with, say, manufacturing or refinery, in terms of video, audio, other things like that, and the documents to actually run the refinery, books of knowledge and so on, is actually much larger than the other types of data. I mean, the metric is that 80% of the world's data is unstructured data. But the good news is now in the age of AI, the tools are available to take that unstructured data and get great insights out of it to help make better business decisions. And then that's the great opportunity, is to go and use that data that's been available for us forever, that we've never had the tools to really use.
So what you're saying is it's actually not even, in a lot of cases, connected to the decision-making data stream. Is that fair to say?
I think the really innovative companies now are taking all of that data that has not been used in the past, that unstructured data, and they're using the new tools to really make better business decisions faster, and which gives them a competitive advantage. So, again, everybody's looking to do things better, faster, quicker for their customers, provide a new service and so on. So there's that opportunity to take the data that's been sitting on our shelves, so to speak, our virtual or physical shelves, and really start to use it in a meaningful business way.
But
Very
here's
cool.
the
So-
problem with
Yeah,
that.
go ahead.
More data gives you maybe visibility. But do you trust the data? That becomes the question. And, trust really relates to data quality, people's interpretation of it. And is it really accurate, or is it fundamentally flawed in some way, shape, or form? And I'm not assessing it, but then that if you're especially in the oil and gas or the mining industry, what you're trying to do is have the best data you can that allows you to do predictive maintenance, or create a digital twin, or optimize projects that have huge, either capital intensive or financially intensive investments. And again, there's lots of studies out there that if you're an offshore oil rig or some sort of mineral processing facility, if you have a single day of unplanned downtime, that can easily be over $3, $4, $5 million a day. And ultimately, if you continue to wait for that perfect data and you don't feel you can trust it, if you don't feel you can make decisions on it, even having visibility to it means that by waiting for that perfect dashboard, you're absorbing millions of dollars in preventable costs while you search for that data, regardless of where it comes from.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we talked a lot about getting the right data from wherever it happens to be into the data pipeline and removing the bad data from the pipeline. So I think that's relatively clear now. I want to talk about two different pieces to kind of resolving some of this decision-making paralysis, right? Let's say all of this information is available, but it takes a day to assemble the whole thing, or maybe the sources of data that you're going to are only gathered or synchronized overnight. And then other forms of data are almost real time, right? Where the information comes directly to you. And then there's other sources of data that actually have analysis in the middle of them, where you have project managers and divisional leaders or plant managers doing assessments on your behalf and providing you with the results. The timing of these data points and the quality of when they show up to you. I want to talk about the timing primarily. Wade, how have you found companies quantifying the value of that, right? Because in a lot of times, if you're wanting to get real-time or near real-time data, you're having to build real-time communication systems to the source of that data, whereas now it may not be there in real time, right? It might be data that's handed off in less expensive ways, right? So Talk to me a little bit about how you quantify the value of that and what's involved in getting real-time data versus maybe dealing with slightly older data.
Just the value comes down to how it's going to help drive business outcomes, the key performance indicators, and so on. And of course, that varies with every business as to what would help them make a better business decision. And then you have to work backwards on that outcome. Is the data set available to help make that decision? Can you trust it? Is it current data? Is it old data? And so on, But I find that certainly in the work I do, we always start with what is the outcome the business needs, like maybe increase customer satisfaction, and by 10% within a year. Okay, that's a very specific goal. And then, how are we going to measure that? Well, we can go measure customer satisfaction in various ways. Then we start working backwards to figure out how we're going to get quality data that's going to demonstrate that, yes, we're getting a good sample of our customers' sentiment, and we know that we've actually improved satisfaction by 10% within a year. But, a good thing to think about is what is the outcome we need and working backwards from it. Okay. And then making sure the data sets that are there to help make that decision are of high quality and trustworthy data.
Yeah, I think here's a real life example.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're a mechanical contractor doing plant turnarounds and you look back at your historical data and you're able to figure out, how do I win bids more often? Do I do the plant turnaround cheaper, faster, better? Your historical data will allow you and your sales teams to predict how to win and more often, bid more accurately, because that's the other problem inherent, is that if you're not looking at your historical data, you may fool yourself what your margins are on specific equipment turnarounds. And at the end of the day, you're making bad business decisions. So the financial impact can be very severe if you not only think about data in real time, but historical data. So I think it's, in my perspective, from a business point of view, I think there's a balance there, Roland.
Okay, so both are important, the historical pieces and the real-time pieces. One thing I want to add to this discussion, and then we'll get on to another line of thinking here. In today's market, where AI is allowing us to do much more predictive work and much valuable insights into where trends are going, whether that's predictive maintenance, whether it's decision-making in supply chain, those predictions are most valuable when they're seen as early as possible in the process, right? So one of the things that timing does impact quite substantially is these new predictive engines that we're seeing come forward through AI tools that are in the market. And so that is also driving a need to get more recent data in place. But I would agree with you, Mark, there's definitely value in historical data as well. I want to end off our discussion here by going back to something that Mark said really early in the discussion. You talked about the psychology of not making decisions. You referenced specifically the psychology of the people that are subject to those decisions, right? I guess what I'm interested in is there also a psychology in play in what causes the indecision to happen? Because sometimes the data is being blamed for indecision, but there might be other factors involved. Why is it that some people can make decisions even when the data isn't there based on what they believe the story looks like, and other people are stuck in their analysis and can't really move forward? What's happening there, Mark?
Well, I like the term analysis paralysis. If you don't trust the data, you're going to keep questioning it over and over and over again. Again, if you look at some of the characteristics of market leaders, the executive team has data, but they probably also trust their gut too. And, we've been all doing this a long time, and sometimes the gut decisions are maybe even the better ones. But back to, okay, is there a balance point between getting stuck in analysis paralysis and not having to always rely on your gut? I think there is. And there's some great work and analysis being done in the market that says there's a good enough for now framework that's been created, that you've defined some tolerance thresholds. You know what the minimum data quality is to make a decision. You match the data value to the risk of the decision you're making. You're not afraid to tweak it. But at the end of the day, you see that, you know what? This is 70% accurate is okay for this type of decision. 95% accurate has to be for this type of other decision. But ultimately, this good enough for now framework, I think, allows you to avoid this stuck in the mud analysis paralysis and allows you to feel confident that your organization is looking at the data. You can clean it up in parallel, but at the end of the day, the value that you're getting from that data is sufficient to support the decisions you're making in your company.
Amazing. I love that. Both the gut feel aspect of it and also being able to somehow quantify it in your decision-making process. Do we have enough here to make the right decision, right? And what advantage do we really have in waiting, right?
And we always kind of come back to the financial side of that. But if you think back to where we started, I said there were really two cost factors. The other one is psychological. We can't lose sight of the fact that workforce burnout drops significantly when daily operations become predictable. Wow. So if we're able to feel, again, that we're not stuck in over-analyzing the balance sheet item or this particular general ledger account because we feel it's out of whack, I'll tell you, I think that you're running your organization more proactively. You're still holding people accountable for their decision. That's not removed. But
Right.
because you've set this good enough for now framework and you're measuring yourselves in that, I think you got one of the top drawer corporations going right there.
That's awesome guidance. I love that. I want to come back on the comment made around financial risk. I think most of us think about risk in financial terms, and I like the fact that you're pushing us beyond that because you're familiar with financial risk systems. Do those systems allow for intangible risks like the psychological ones that you identified, maybe the costs associated with not making a decision? Like those are also risk elements, right? How do you incorporate those into a system of risk analysis when you're making decisions?
Roland, I just added another comment around data risk. In oil and gas, many companies have extensive well logs that are on paper. And they're warehoused in hopefully secure warehouses where a fire, water, damage, so it won't actually destroy those records. I think about another company, nonprofit, that we did extensive work with. They had 22 years of medical research archived in paper documents, in binders, in a warehouse. And the big risk for them was what would happen if somehow a fire unfortunately got into the warehouse and destroyed those records. They had no backup, you know. So if you can digitize some of those paper records, and that's only one style of record, right? It sort of comes back to my comment about unstructured data. You get it digitized so you can now have it backed up and archived in a much safer format. And people forget about that. These paper records sometimes have great value. And, you know, another organization that we're working with in the Arctic, they have many years of land records around things that have been done on the land, such as drilling wells and so on. And those are all paper documents. And again, you can't go recreate that if they're lost. Yeah. So think about the paper documents and what you're going to do to get them into a better format.
Anything else to add, Mark, before we wrap it here? This has been a really interesting conversation that I don't know that I've seen a lot of people have.
The conclusion in my mind, reflecting on our last conversation together, is this: better data matters. Waiting for perfect data becomes a very expensive habit.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Wade, any other comments from yourself?
We talked a bit about how if you're a publicly traded company, you have to publish your financials every quarter. For me, an interesting benchmark is to look at how quickly the end of the quarter a company can publish its numbers. To me, that is a bit of a telling number, because if it takes a long time, often there's a real reason behind that. Maybe they did some acquisitions and they have multiple ERP systems, financial systems they have not brought together. So you should benchmark. If you're a business, you should benchmark yourself against best of breed companies around just how quickly you can produce your financial results every quarter. And that will give you a good benchmark to see if you need to make improvements.
And I'll give you one other real life example. In upstream oil and gas, waiting for perfectly integrated reservoir and production data causes permanent damage to underground resources. What's the reality? Subsurface dynamics change constantly. And if operators wait for flawless data integration before beginning modeling a water flood or a secondary recovery program, they risk unexpected water breakthroughs. The result is that traps millions of barrels of oil permanently underground, degrading the net present value of the entire field. That's huge.
That's huge.
Please don't wait for the perfect data. Get started now. Identify the benchmarks that you set for what level of risk on your data. Are you comfortable with making these types of decisions versus others? Because the impact of waiting, again, is huge.
Absolutely. So Mark, Wade, and I work for an advisory and technology company called Charter. Charter works with industrial companies to move past this trap of waiting for perfect data. We help leaders to identify the decisions that matter the most. We map those data sources that support those decisions. And then we prioritize the practical integration steps that improve visibility without overwhelming the business. For many companies, the starting point is not a massive data transformation program. It is a focused effort to connect the right data sources, whether it's operational data, financial data, maintenance data, or field data. We work with teams to build processes and systems that result in less time debating the numbers and more time acting on them.